It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and it's tape number 509, September the 6th, 1981. Libyan leader Gaddafi gave a warning to the Western nations, and particularly Ronald Reagan, and he threatened to attack American nuclear bases in the Mediterranean if the U.S. Navy challenges his control of the Gulf of Sidra. He's warned the people of Sicily, Crete, Turkey, and all states of the Mediterranean that if the United States provokes him, he will intentionally attack a nuclear deposit in these various countries and cause an international catastrophe. He said, "We are willing to die for the Gulf of Sidra. We will make the Gulf of Sidra a new Red Sea with our blood." The interesting thing about this article is that I don't believe foreign policy is going to be made much longer in the White House with the struggling people there, Mr. Baker and Mr. Meese and Deaver and Haig, Allens, Stessel, the whole gang that I've mentioned many, many weeks on these programs and itemized them. And I'll do a little more later pertaining to another article and foreign policy of Ronald Reagan if I have time. I think foreign policy is going to be made quietly by both our allies and our enemies, and the boundaries that Ronald Reagan is going to be able to move will be decided in many ways by a group of people, whether it's suicidal, kamikaze, or whatever. He will push these people to the brink, and they have nothing to lose, and they will gain their own national pride. And Gaddafi has given fair warning that he will, in quotes, intentionally attack the nuclear depots. Now, when you have a man as President of the United States with a gang around him, such as Caspar Weinberger and Alexander Haig, it is our responsibility to let them know what you think and feel, because when they provoke these suicidal teams, our oil is cut off, hundreds of thousands or millions of people can die from nuclear intentional accidents. We could escalate a war that brings all of us in. When you get men who are idiots, who have fire in their teeth, who make tremendous profits out of war, out of weapons, out of selling ammunition to both sides, when you get people that have been put in political office for the sole purpose of World War III, and don't be deceived by that big smile that Ronald Reagan has. When they're there for that purpose, they'll drag you to the lowest level of their low mentality, and there's nothing lower than this gang. It's up to you to let them know, and for me to let them know that I don't appreciate their provoking people to the brink of the kind of accidents that are going to be intentional. There's a new book out. I don't have it yet. I just got the title this week. It is available, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, by Paul Manning, written and mentions his friend Edward R. Murrow, the late radiocaster who I believe was murdered, and I may do more on that at another time. He was a friend of Murrow's and discussed many times Martin Bormann, the Nazi, with Murrow. This book is put out by Lyle Stewart. It's $14.95. It is on the list of research, the list of books that are available for various people interested in this entire era from the end of World War I to the present date and the causes for so much pain and for the pain that's going to follow. In this book, in essence, I was told that it mentions about 750 companies that Bormann figured if the Nazis controlled after World War II, they could control the world. And primarily, this book is about I.G. Farben. Now, that's an interesting corporation to begin with in wanting to control the world. They not only had offices in Germany, but they had them in New Jersey. And George Korkola, who set up the assassination teams with Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley and the CIA, and we'll do more on that later, his headquarters are in New Jersey. Standard Oil New Jersey has had a link to a lot of the political operations that are national and international to a great extent. The Polish Pope, the present Pope that was put into power, worked for I.G. Farben. It was the branch of Farben at that time was called Solvay, chemical at Auschwitz that made the gas for extermination of not only Jews but all kinds of people at Auschwitz. This Pope worked at for Solvay, which was I.G. Farben, and he went on to become the leader of the Catholic world, and that's a large mass of population. As I say, he began his career under the Nazis working for I.G. Farben. It's interesting, when I learned about this book, I was told by Tom Davis that much of what I've been saying on these various programs on the air every week and putting together my research is confirmed, unfortunately confirmed, in his book on Martin Bormann. It tells how he retrenched in 1944 to organize the Odessa, the Spider, the German Nazi network around the world and put into corporations. I could name a large group of corporations that would fall into the 750, such as General Motors and U.S. Steel and Nestle's chocolate and ITT, and particularly defense industries such as the Hughes aircraft. I believe that after 1957, Howard Hughes was kidnapped and literally removed by 1966 from the scene and never seen again by anybody in this country. And the entire Hughes Aerospace, the Hughes Airplanes, the Hughes Medical Institute was a cover for assassination teams and for the Nazification of America. Now, I've been pointed in the United States, this particular method of getting rid of politicians, whether it's John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or Martin Luther King, or Malcolm X, or getting down to the Chappaquiddick affair where Hunt and Liddy and Tony Lasowitz worked for Howard Hughes when Hughes was non-existent. The entire Watergate team, the plumbers, the COINTEL program, all working under the umbrella of the Hughes organization. I can pinpoint that particular organization, and if you had the Hughes organization and I.G. Farben and maybe 40 companies, you could control the world. Bechtel in San Francisco, that's international, and so forth. But this book mentions not all of the companies, but the fact that these Nazis under Martin Bormann decided by 1944, and the war was officially over by 1945, that they would have their gold and wealth out of Germany and the means and communication to continue the Fourth Reich when the other war scaled down. There was another article. I'm going to skip to a subject which is dear to my heart and important, always having to do with the Kennedy assassination, because when I started to find out who killed John Kennedy, that tapped right into Nazi spies and Nazis as early as 1964. I'd made those connections. This last week, there was a UPI Associated Press story with the title, "Soviet Diplomat, the Spy May Have Fooled the FBI." This has to do with the famous Yuri Nosenko, a man who came to the United States and was sequestered away from the Warren Commission and kept secret. He's on the pay of the CIA at the present time. But there's a book coming out now saying that Yuri Nosenko worked for Moscow and the KGB and that he fooled the FBI when he came to this country. And it's a book of disinformation. The Reader's Digest is publishing the segments this October about Yuri Nosenko, Nosenko. Reader's Digest also published a book by Edward J. Epstein, Inquest, which was an apology. Half the book was accurate and half the book was an apology for the Warren Commission and said they did a good job. They also hired Poinsettia Pierce, that notorious woman involved with the Nelson Rockefeller murder who called for the ambulance and then disappeared, who helped out Megan Marshak. And they also hired Alex Haley, who wrote a book on Malcolm X that covered up that murder. The Kennedy murder, the Nelson Rockefeller murder, the Malcolm X were all CIA, and the Reader's Digest hired writers and exposed disinformation on all of these murders. Now they're doing a segment of a book called Shadran, The Spy Who Never Came Back by Henri Curiel, which is a series of disinformation and lies, I can tell you in advance, because Yuri Nosenko was not a KGB defector from the Soviet Union who really stayed a Soviet spy and worked with Lee Harvey Oswald and fooled J. Edgar Hoover about who he was. This is entirely a false story. If any of you are interested or have the book by Bernard Fensterwald called Coincidence or Conspiracy. It came out in 1977. He has a section on Yuri Nosenko, a top Soviet intelligence agent who defected to the United States. And Fensterwald describes some of Nosenko's activities and has a photograph of him on page 223, but doesn't go into as much detail as Fensterwald could on Yuri Nosenko. In this book, however, that he wrote on the John Kennedy assassination, he said that among the Nosenko files, it was known that there was a consuming interest of the CIA into Yuri Nosenko and Lee Harvey Oswald. And Nosenko commented the possibility that Lee Harvey Oswald might be a sleeper agent for the American intelligence. And this is, in fact, the truth. What Nosenko was saying for his own identity and for hundreds of thousands of dollars that he was paid later, he let out a little hint of what he knew, that he worked with the Oswald file in the Soviet Union. And Nosenko actually is a very important person because he is the link of Lee Harvey Oswald to Navy intelligence and the U-2 flights when Lee Harvey Oswald was stationed in an intelligence activity in the Soviet Union. Now, Bernard Fensterwald mentions several times the role that the CIA had in persuading the Rockefeller Committee, this is at the time of Watergate, to keep Nosenko's identity secret, and how Daniel Shore, the newsman, was fired from CBS when he was in the process of talking about Yuri Nosenko and the role that Nosenko had in hinting of Lee Harvey Oswald being a possible CIA agent in the Soviet Union. They kept that out of the Rockefeller report. Sylvia Marr, in her index of the John Kennedy assassinations, has indexed the House Select Committee hearings on Yuri Nosenko, and if you want to look those up, in Volume 2, page 436 to 536, there are pages and references to Nosenko. Nosenko was contacting the Central Intelligence Agency, even though his cover was KGB, in June of '62. That was after Lee and Marina Oswald landed in the United States of America. He made his first contacts because he worked on the Oswald file, and as hinted, Oswald was in the CIA when he was in the Soviet Union. January 23, 1964, 2 months after Kennedy was killed, Nosenko was in Geneva, and he contacted the CIA and said, "Bring me to the United States." He didn't go back to Russia. In 1964, of April 4th, 1964, he was brought to the Washington, Maryland area, and he was kept from the Warren Commission and from members of the commission so that the FBI and CIA never asked Yuri Nosenko any of the information about his relationship to the Central Intelligence Agency and Oswald's role to the CIA, even though Allen Dulles on the Warren Commission, who was director of the CIA, of course, knew all about it. They carefully kept every bit out of the first investigation, the Warren Commission report, which was 552 witnesses and 26 volumes of witness testimony and exhibit. Didn't have a hint of Nosenko, but when the House Select Committee on Assassinations did their work in 1978, the conditions that they could bring up Nosenko's name was that John Hart of the CIA could talk about Nosenko before the House Select Committee on the condition that they don't mention Lee Harvey Oswald. They could only mention Nosenko, and Congressman Dodd said, "You've talked for an hour and a half, and wasn't the purpose of your being here to talk about Oswald?" And Hart said, "I will not discuss Lee Harvey Oswald and Nosenko. If they expect me to do that, I would leave." So Nosenko is right now, a very well-paid agent of the CIA. He's not KGB. If he were what this book says he is, the Reader's Digest, he wouldn't be paid by the CIA. He got a huge sum of money by staying sequestered away for many years, and he had a home on the shore with a yacht and boat. And a man used to visit him. He used to come down from New England to visit him, and the man was John Paisley. Paisley was the CIA agent of Navy intelligence for the National Security Council, National Security Agency, that was in charge of the Soviet division. Mary Ann Paisley and her husband, John Paisley, were paymasters and activists with spies like Oswald, who went to the Soviet Union as defectors but were with Navy intelligence and doing jobs like grounding the U-2 to cause the détente or the discussions of peace between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Oswald could be very useful. And along with them were John and Mary Hart. The four of them were in the Soviet division, and John Paisley was killed at the time of the hearings of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and Bernard Fensterwald, the gentleman who wrote this book, who headed the committee to investigate assassinations, who was James McCord's attorney at the time of Watergate when they broke that story open about the covering up of Nixon's team. Fensterwald has worked with the CIA all of his life, and he represents Mrs. Paisley. She has questioned whether her husband did in fact die. At the time, they said he was murdered. His hands and fingers were cut off, and there was no identity, and she couldn't see the body. But Paisley had a direct radio communication to Australia, and was involved with the CIA and that famous Nugan Bank that I keep referring to that collapsed. He was working with Edwin Wilson, the men I talk about often on the air here, people involved with the killing of Allende, with Letelier in Washington, D.C. The major assassination teams, this Paisley gang and the Hart gang and the CIA are all molded to this ball of wax, and it's very important that new books come out keeping Nosenko on the KGB burner, because this is the bottom line of who killed John Kennedy. The answers are all there, and the people who were involved in this scheme to kill the president or other candidates, their names are surfacing in the news every single day for various researchers who know what to see and what to look for. But as soon as the Nugan Bank collapsed, John Paisley's name was linked to it. His photograph was in the London Times. And the CIA gang, from the Bay of Pigs on up through just to the present day, continuous murders and assassinations, have a link of agents and meeting places, and they've covered it so well up to the present date, but they haven't covered it well enough. And that's why new books come out on matters such as Nosenko fooling the FBI. He didn't fool the FBI, and everybody in Washington in the intelligence community knows who he is. Back in January of 1979, I did 4 radio tapes or more on Yuri Nosenko on the House Select Committee on Assassinations. One was tape 373, if you want to order those. Another one was tape 372, January the 19th, 1979. And I asked on that hour on the radio, what does Congress and the Justice Department have to conceal? The links of the KGB, CIA agents inside the Soviet Union, the web of Reinhard Gehlen's agents and the Nazi spies from Argentina to Minsk to the United States, the links of Lee and Marina Oswald, agents of Navy intelligence and the CIA. And then I referred to the testimony of John Hart on Yuri Nosenko and the very important person that he was, a connecting link to the United States intelligence, military intelligence, to agents such as Lee and Marina Oswald. Now, Marina is a woman who has worn off her brainwashing that Priscilla Johnson and the others did on her. She's very lucid. She's very aware of the traps they've put her in. I just talked to her today, as a matter of fact, on some very important matters. And Marina Oswald understands now that the KGB doesn't do all of the things that the United States media says it does. And she used the expression, why don't we clean up our own house and look at the CIA and FBI? When she came to this country, she was worried that the KGB wiretapped or bugged or listened or spied, and that Russia was filled with spies. Then she learned that ever since she arrived in this country, her telephone's been tapped, her neighbor moved across the street to put her under surveillance, and that almost every person that she contacted who offered to help her was from the Defense Department and the intelligence community. And luckily, she's a bright woman, and she's catching on, and it won't be too many years, as I say before, you'll see headlines on some of these characters, but they're trying to cover it up. Another attempt to cover up. The ministers of propaganda were working so hard this week. I guess you saw the stories. A British TV show claimed that the people who planned to kill the Pope, the assassination attempt, were from the KGB. This was in the London Times, and a long story about plans to kill the Pope, and they tried to pin Agca, the man who shot at the Pope, as being part of KGB. Now, there isn't a piece of evidence to support that, and one of the quotations they had for a program called TVI was an Italian journalist, Francesco De Andrio, who worked with a newspaper that was actually named with the Licio Gelli scandal of the man who fled Italy with that P2 scandal that hasn't even really begun to burst open with its worldwide implications of, again, Nazi links, the John Hinckley that shot at Ronald Reagan, or Mohammed Agca that shot at the Pope, strong links to an international Nazi group that Martin Bormann set up years ago. So they're trying to blame the KGB for the shooting of the Pope. The working theory that they held was, how could it be anybody else? It would have to be KGB because nobody else would want to shoot the Pope. That was TVI, a theory that the KGB was involved. Now, the Vatican responded and said the KGB did not become a suspect in the attempted murder of the Pope. They have seen no evidence of it. They know that Agca had accomplices, and they are also looking, this is from the Vatican, that individuals have blamed the CIA as well as the KGB and a fascist Turkish group, even Gaddafi and the Libyan leader Gaddafi. Now, an article in the San Jose Mercury just today said the U.S. Embassy in Rome formally protested last month when the Soviet Union distributed in Italy a magazine called Today, which said the CIA had interest in removing the Pope. They said the Pope would have disagreed on U.S. policy in El Salvador, and the United States had to get rid of them. Well, one of the programs that I gave on the shooting of the Pope and the motives for possible assailants to kill the Pope, one was a Muslim-Christian war, and I ruled that out. The other is a far-right group, more fascist than most military governments, who wants no interference with a possible bloodbath in Central America, El Salvador, the Honduras, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. Now, I put that down as a possible reason. I had 5 reasons on a tape I did May 17th on this program, giving 5 reasons and motives to develop on the possible shooting of the Pope, and one of them was what the Soviet Union was saying, that he would object to the way that we are decapitating and mutilating and killing, and El Salvador isn't the only country that is going to spread through all of Central America. Another motive I gave was the Protestant versus the Catholic motive. There's a strong dislike of the power of the Catholic Church, and that goes into, again, Licio Gelli, the Freemasons, the fascists. Gelli worked with Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and Perón, and even though some of those were Catholic, there is a large group of Carl McIntyre and a group from Texas and Florida and the Sun Belt who object to the Pope. Also, interference with the narcotics war that is going on between hierarchy in the United States that involves Michael Sindona, who was the treasurer for the Vatican money and invested Vatican money into organized crime, into the Gambino family, and the Vatican is losing many, many millions every month. I had a list of possible motives, and one of them in a newspaper put out in Rome coincided with one of the motives that I had. It could be a combination of motives, but I doubt that the KGB would accomplish a thing. They claim that he was going to go to the funeral in Poland of his close friend, and that he would have made a resurgence of the feeling of the church against the communist countries, that his presence in Poland would be a threat to that powder keg that is going on. Well, that powder keg is indeed instigated the solidarity with money from United States labor movements and the Central Intelligence Agency. But one more trip to Poland wouldn't tilt the balance, because the Soviet Union isn't going to give up Poland after being attacked in 2 wars any more than Libya is going to be attacked any more by the United States presence just inches off their water. So the story that the KGB tried to shoot the Pope is ridiculous, and there is not a bit of evidence on that score, but there is a lot more evidence of a link of the Pope to Michael Sindona, and the investigation of Sindona that took place just 2 days before the Pope was shot, going to Licio Gelli, the link of the Vatican investor with a man who was involved with Martin Bormann and the Nazis of Argentina and down in South America in Uruguay. This Licio Gelli has dual citizenship and works with the closest assassination teams, the death squads in Argentina and Uruguay. And Licio Gelli worked with Michael Sindona and organized crime families, and Sindona was a financier for the Vatican. So when the Gelli story was breaking and Licio Gelli fled down to Argentina and hasn't been seen since, his daughter was arrested and held, and she had papers linking the CIA to her father and Sindona is linked to the mafia. That's the ball of wax that tried to silence the Pope, I believe, and to kill the Pope, not the KGB. There were more reasons to think that this was a mob hit because of the entanglement of the Nazis and the drug dealers and the Vatican than there is to think that the KGB would want to shoot them. In fact, the KGB can sit back if they do any research and enjoy the entanglement of the Roman Catholic Vatican, caught with the Gambino organized crime family. Sindona's been charged with murder of judges and investigators in Milan, and the entanglement to the fascists down in Argentina and Uruguay. And Licio Gelli was at the inauguration of Ronald Reagan and funds the Republican Party to its teeth. And then they send people like Frank Sinatra down to Argentina for $1 million concert, and South Africa for $2 million, probably filling in the Gelli fund that has to be floating. I can't say for sure, but Sinatra picks up these tremendous fees, and it's closely linked to Argentine connections now. To the KGB, we get more pleasure, I think, out of seeing this all fall down than take a chance that somebody in the Soviet Union would shoot the Pope. As I said before, if you shoot one Pope, you get another Pope, and there isn't much he's going to do with those people in Poland. They're going to have to get to work and work out their own problems, and I don't think that it has to do with that. Another article which links into these stories, I'll start it, and then we'll do more on the second half hour of this program. It's from the Washington Post, Wednesday, August 19th, called "French Socialists Seek to Solve the Slaying of Alleged Spy Master." Now, this is a fascinating story that, again, links and goes into Licio Gelli in Rome and the shooting of the Pope, even though the killing of this particular man was a few years ago. In essence, this is the story of a Frenchman named Henri Curiel, C-U-R-I-E-L, and he's been compared to Dreyfus and the Dreyfus affair because he's Jewish, and he was murdered and smeared before he was murdered and tried to be linked to the KGB. Again, like they say, the would-be assailant of the Pope was linked to the KGB, or Yuri Nisenko to the KGB. Now, this murder took place at a time when Curiel had an organization in France to help the Third World, and the job he was doing was exposing undemocratic fascist takeover of the Third World countries. I guess you would call Gaddafi a Third World country, and then when the CIA pours millions of dollars into equipment and training and literally takes over a lot of the machinery, they turn that country into a fascist country. In summary, in the United States, after World War II was over, Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's intelligence, made up a hidden government in our country, in the United States, and called it the National Security Council and the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA. In Italy, Licio Gelli, at identical time, had a hidden government that was planning coups d'etats and to put fascism in power, similar to the coup we had in Dallas or the killing of Robert Kennedy before he could become president. And he set up terrors and murders linked to this Gehlen group. And in France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, also with his special intelligence, his domestic called the DST and his international SDEC, were all linked, and again with Great Britain, underneath the belly of every so-called democratic country. And these NATO allies are a group of Nazi fascists, getting back again to what this Bormann book is about, is a network of Nazis waiting to control the world. And in France, they took this man who wanted to help countries get on their own feet and smeared him as being a suspected KGB spy. And the same people that did the work, who wrote books about him and linked them, are people in the news today who are prominent, trying to blame terrorism on the KGB when actually there isn't a day that goes by that terrorism isn't coming out from the bowels of the CIA. We'll take a break for 1 minute, and I'm going back to this case because of the parallels that are running through each of these countries.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, on part two, on the second half, I'm going to go into some detail this article in the Washington Post on the murder in Paris of Henri Curiel. Interesting that it was in the Washington Post Foreign Service, and it came out August 19th, and in all of the newspapers that I take, and I take about 10 a day and get clippings from 10 other places around the country, I haven't seen any other mention of this particular French problem, while the very people named in the article are in the news and are trying to push again the KGB terrorists around the world. Now, Curiel began to be smeared in 1976. They began to take his name and throw it around, and by the time he was murdered, May the 4th, 1978, people thought he was a Soviet spy and involved in espionage. There were books that came out just recently, a whole series of books smearing Curiel and using his name, and his widow has already had lawsuits and has had alterations on some of them already. One was the Curiel Network by Roland Gaucher, Gaucher. The other is the Terror Network. You've heard of that book, and I've mentioned it before, by Claire Sterling. Claire Sterling is important because of the group in Washington, D.C., funded by Richard Mellon Scaife, who fund the far right in this country and who have continuously made lies about the Soviet Union. The other book is The Spike. That's a famous book that is now into many printings. They want to make a movie by Robert Moss and Arnaud de Borchgrave called The Spike. And these people, Gaucher, Sterling, Moss, and Borchgrave, were writing about this poor fellow, Henri Curiel, and his KGB links, at a time when they were working with Alexander Haig and the Georgetown University and Richard Mellon Scaife and that gang, just at the time that the Pope was shot and Reagan was shot. They were shot by Nazis, people sympathetic to the Nazi group, the youth group, or the domestic Nazis in this country. And their books came out at a time when Claire Sterling and the others who wrote The Spike were on radio all over this country, and also over in London, where Robert Moss has a weekly or daily column blaming the KGB. And of course, if Haig took over and Bush took over the federal government, if Reagan had died or if he dies, they will push that KGB story, and they work very closely with these people. And they also work closely, Haig in NATO, with Licio Gelli and the fascist organization that wanted a coup there. And they work closely in the United States with Gehlen, Hitler's spies, that conceived and did the coups in this country to wipe out the politicians who could speak up to represent what the people might have wanted. Now the news media is so slanted, you don't even know what they want anymore. But the power to assassinate and cover up and control the press is so great that these books just keep coming out. The important thing about this story is that now that Mitterrand is in power in France, this Washington Post article says he wants to get to the bottom of this murder. Not only was Curiel murdered, but 6 other people were murdered, and they're trying to link the Jews of Paris, or this Jew, to anti-democratic processes to make him look like a communist, where in fact he always worked very close with de Gaulle and was sympathetic to what Charles de Gaulle wanted, and Mitterrand wants to go into the matter. Now, they believe that the former president of France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, destroyed or had destroyed evidence of this or these other murders, and they asked the French Minister of Interior for information, similar to our Freedom of Information Act, on this case, and they got an answer back, which I thought I'd read on the air, which is similar to what we get when we want information from Freedom of Information, and they just say they don't have it, or it's missing, or it's destroyed. The French government wrote back in response to requests on these murders, "It is not forbidden to think that very fact of ordering the appraisal Another term for your request is likely to incite the disappearance of the fact one seeks to ascertain. It is not forbidden to think that the very fact that you order or require or request this information is not forbidden to think that this could cause the disappearance of the very fact one seeks to ascertain. And that's the answer they got when they wanted the information on Henri Curiel. Now, he, like many other people, was helping the Third World, and this is how Licio Gelli in Italy or the CIA does in this country. They kill the leaders and distort those people who are working for higher wages or health plans or employment in these other countries, or building facilities or health facilities, whether it's water or schools or food programs. We tear down the land reform programs and put in these fascist dictatorships, and that's what Curiel was doing. They tried to link him to subversive activities and used leaks, and later they traced the leaks to fascist organizations, where his institution was really just fighting fascism. It became clear to Mitterrand, and he decided, when he became in power, that he would open this up to see that to be interested in social progress or against torture is not to be a Soviet agent. The socialists said that they want to be helpful. They've asked for the files to be open. They've asked for a new commission to clear Curiel of wrongdoing, the way they smeared him, and they dislike the rejection of the request for information. So the French courts are going into this, and the wife of Curiel, Rose Curiel, sued one particular author, Roland Gaucher, because of a book that was not true called The Curiel Network. Now, this is the way books come out, whether Yuri Nosenko was KGB or Curiel was a Soviet spy. They write these things, and they're not sued by members of the family. Unfortunately, this disinformation pours out. She has sued this particular writer, so in his book, every copy, they have to print a disclaimer, insert in each book, that what they said about him may not necessarily be accurate. But the important thing is that there's another lawsuit going on against Claire Sterling, who wrote The Terror Network. And I say she works closely with the Young Americans for Freedom, with Richard Mellon Scaife, with the New Right, with the Georgetown University, with the Ministers of Propaganda, with the big lie stick in Washington, D.C. Claire Sterling's book, The Terror Network, is a bunch of BS, and she goes on these talk shows and pumps that book. Somebody asked her when she was on KGO why she only talks about suspected terrorism of the left and doesn't talk about the right, the death squads in Brazil and Paraguay and Uruguay and Chile and Argentina and the Nazis in America. She says, well, this particular book is just about KGB terrorism. A section of this book was printed by the Washington Post in Rome, March 15th, 1981, mentioning Henri Curiel as being a spy or a KGB agent. March 15th, 1981 was just 15 days before Ronald Reagan was shot in this country, and just 15 days before Claire Sterling was talking about terrorism. Now, one good way to get rid of the President of the United States and make George Bush, former director of the CIA, president, and Alexander Haig of NATO, working with Nazi Gelli and Galen and Bormann and the whole gang, one way to give them power is to get in on the wave of killing the President of the United States and then saying, we don't condone this terrorism, and then publishing disinformation. Fortunately, in this case, Ronald Reagan lived, and the Washington Post is being sued also for the things they said about this particular man. There is a concerted effort to smear this man. The French intelligence did it, just as the British network, the London Times, the radio, TV will say that a KGB agent shot at the Pope, or that John Hinckley Jr. was a lone assassin instead of going into where he got his money. The networks are negligent. The intelligence networks do not tell the truth on the spy network and where it's really coming from. The intelligence systems, according to this investigation into the Curiel case, said that these intelligence systems in France, and this could be applying to ours, are anti-labor, they're anti-poor, they're anti-underdeveloped, The Washington Post article says they work with fascist and Nazi organizations, and they work with anybody who helps put the people down. Anyone that they consider an enemy has to be destroyed by two ways: either kill them or link them to communism. So what they did with Curiel, they linked him to the communists first, and then 2 years later he and 6 others were killed. And Mitterrand is looking into the accusations that the DST, that's the French intelligence similar to our FBI, and the other espionage services, the SDEC, the international, like the CIA, were playing a part. Now, what activities happen in France seem removed maybe from your Defense Department, or what happens in Italy seems removed. But if you get an overall view that Martin Bormann, the master genius behind Hitler, went with unlimited money and counterfeit money and so forth down to South America to set up a network all over the world and sent top Nazis in this country in the CIA, in the universities, into the hospitals, then it isn't removed from what we do. So that books that are taunted by the American publishers, such as The Spike or these various non-objective books blaming people that are doing social work for social benefit as being traitors to their own government when they're not. It is a tremendous disservice. And books like The Terror Network or The Spike get tremendous attention in the media and are never challenged by book reviewers or anybody else as to what they're trying to accomplish and how they do it. So all of the books that have been written against Curiel are being challenged. His widow is challenging it, and the important thing is that Valerie Gustard d'Estaing said, we can't afford a scandal like that. Now, if Jimmy Carter were a genuine Democrat, when he was in power, he would have investigated the political assassinations, the committee to investigate the assassinations, the House Select Committee, he ignored because he was handpicked by David Rockefeller and the Trilateral. We don't have a Democratic Party anymore, and it's a tragedy because the people that are in power have total carte blanche to lie and blame and accuse while they themselves are in the action. Another important article, a third-part series, I've mentioned it twice before, and this one I'll have to outline at great length for you and maybe do one entire Sunday evening. It's a new section by Jeff Gerth and Philip Taubman, capitalizing on the CIA. It's from the New York Times today, September the 6th, 1981. And if you live on the West Coast, the San Jose Mercury is covering these stories. Now, this article is more into Edwin Wilson of the CIA, the problem the director William Casey has on his hands. Another agent, Thomas G. Kleins, gets into this picture, and it tells about Frank E. Turple and Edwin Wilson and the CIA arming Gaddafi and sending weapons with CIA companies into Saudi Arabia, Latin America, the Far East, Libya, Egypt, and Mexico. They arm Egypt to the hilt and they arm Gaddafi to the hilt, and they're both enemies. But there's an interesting and a frightening thing I want to mention to you, and I mentioned it before, and we must write to these writers or push this out in the open. And as I say, I'll get back to this article later. Famous writers like Seymour Hearsh, who broke the My Lai story, did that 2-part series in the New York Times on Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson. Jack Anderson has written many articles on the assassination teams, the espionage operations of Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson. Alexander Cockburn did a very important article recently in the Village Voice, and Jeff Gerth has written 3 articles so far in the New York Times in the past weeks. So that in terms of inches of news space, this story is getting a lot of coverage, but they're leaving out the name George Gregory Korkola. Write that down if you have a pencil, George Gregory Korkola, K-O-R-K-O-L-A. And I ask, why the silence? I first learned of these characters and talked about them going back there were tapes back in 1979 when they were arrested in New York City at the Hilton Hotel. December 25th, 1979, there was an article about 2 men held in a gun sale, and they mentioned Mr. Korkola, who worked with Frank Turple, owner of the Amstead Corporation of Nutley, New Jersey, that manufactures explosives. It is a legitimate security business that sold detection equipment to Scotland Yard, Exxon, and Mobil. They make briefcases, bombs, paperback book bombs, and all kinds of devices, and Korkola was using a diplomatic plate from the United Nations registered to the Uganda mission. Now, I believe that George Korkola, as well as Frank Churchill and Edwin Wilson, it's acknowledged that they are all linked to Carlos the terrorist, the terror that's coming from the right, the killing of the Munich athletes at the Olympic Games. Years back, they take credit for, but these people worked with Samuel Cummings of the CIA in London, and George Korkola supplying security and equipment to Scotland Yard, Exxon, which is Standard Oil, and Chase Manhattan and Mobil, has to be one of the biggest characters floating around. And the important thing is that the major news media are running article after article and leaving Korkola out. Now, I'm a stubborn person. The more they leave him out, the more I'm going to share him with you on these programs. And they're not the only ones leaving him out. There's a question in the newspaper, a question and answer in the Sunday paper, the San Jose Mercury. It goes into Washington Post. It comes out here. And they ask the question about the CIA training terrorists for Libya. And the answer goes, the news columnist is Scott, who answers every week, refers to Edwin P. Wilson and Frank Churchill and leaves out Korkola. He mentions I mentioned him, McCulley, on many programs, and the articles that Seymour Hearsh did. But Korkola either is dead, and it was Maxine Cheshire who hinted that he had been murdered, or he's hiding, and he's hiding well. But there has to be some written or tacit agreement that these people in the news can use this information, and they're going to be interviewed, and they have been interviewed by Jeff Gerth, a fine writer, Seymour Hearsh, a fine writer, Alexander Cockburn. These are the men, I would say left of middle or in the middle, certainly not the far right writers, the cover-up artists of the ages. These are people that have written valuable information, and we have to get out. Jack Anderson, every column. Why are they leaving out George Korkola? That may be the tender link from I.G. Farben in New Jersey down to the Alpha 66, to the anti-Castro Cubans, to the assassination teams that have gone the whole era, but particularly from John Kennedy up to the present, because Edwin Wilson was part of Task Force 139 at the Nugan Bank in Australia, along with Paisley, I mentioned earlier, in the Kennedy assassination. There is a link of these people from the Bay of Pigs, from the time Lee Harvey Oswald was sent to the Soviet Union with the U-2 adventure. When he was sent there, he didn't know there would be such a thing, but he had been trained at 2 U-2 bases, and they could drop the plane and stop peace conferences if they just happened to take place during Eisenhower's time. But there is a team, James McCord and all of these people from Watergate fame, that run through this era. But every single article, except when they were arrested, when George Korkola and Frank Churchill were arrested in New York in 1979, every single major writer is leaving his name out. Now, a year ago on this program, I gave a list of the most important stories of 1979 and 1978, leading up to 1980, July 1980. And many times I'm going to keep going back to them until they're household words with you, because at the time of Watergate, you didn't know E. Howard Hunt or Frank Sturgis or Charles Colson or G. Gordon Liddy, Tom Charles Houston. They became names identified with modus operandi White House plumbers and the operations inside the White House of Richard Nixon, his administration. Well, at the present time, at a higher level, because of Watergate, we had investigations of the Rockefeller Committee, Representative Pike's Committee, Senator Church, the House Select Committee on Assassination. And because of all of that, and because of many pieces of the puzzle beginning to seep out, a new team of names at a different level have surfaced. And as I say, I mentioned a year ago, just in July 1980, the most important stories of the news. And I don't often repeat on these programs unless it's very important, but these stories will all fit together. And if you watch the news, you will soon be able to see how they fit. I said that Frank Edward Turple and George Gregory Korkola was probably the most important news story of 1980 to break. They were arrested in December, just before 1980. The year began in 1980. And the next most important part was the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Now, that involves the breaking into the Yuri Nosenko CIA links with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union. And then Jonestown and the murder of Representative Leo Ryan, the mind control experiments linked to Chile and Argentina, which again goes back to Australia, the bauxite control of Australia, the Guggenheim Bank, and their links and overlaps to Colonia Dignidad and Jonestown in Chile. Now, all of these stories that I mentioned in July of 80 are surfacing in their own ways. I talked about the murder of Pope John I, and then the Polish Pope came to power, and the link of Vatican and Watergate and organized crime and the Nazis to Auschwitz and I.G. Farben. Now, on the printed sheet that went out in 1980, I was talking about the importance of this Polish Pope. There's a new book out now on I.G. Farben and Martin Bormann and the Nazi connections. There are articles about the links of Licio Gelli and Michael Sindona to the Pope and organized crime. So that as one government flees from Italy and goes down to Argentina, new stories break. As Mitterrand investigates a murder in Paris, new stories will break. As Seymour Hearsh writes for the New York Times, or Jeff Gerth, they are tapping into some very fundamental, basic operations of our intelligence system that have to come open. They may drip out just because you see a tree standing. I read a quotation just today regarding a tree standing. It doesn't mean it isn't growing. And these stories have stood, but there are new branches and leaves, and they are coming out all the time. In fact, one of the top stories that I mentioned was the murder of Nelson Rockefeller to make way for Reagan's nomination, and the murder of John Paisley, who worked with Lee Harvey Oswald, a co-worker, just at the time the House Select Committee was going. The more stories they have to cover up, the more we find later. So it's an interesting time of a lot of news coming out, and in order to make sense, I will sometimes go back and use these names until they become familiar with you. A Nazi died this week. You've all read that, Albert Speer. He was in charge of Hitler's production. He's the one man who didn't claim he was innocent at Nuremberg. He said he was guilty. He loved Adolf Hitler. He engineered Hitler's rise to power. He helped the Third Reich. He was part of the slave labor system. He taught Hitler how to use people from other countries and work them down to the bone and then bring in the next gang on the junk heap. They didn't feed them. They brought in a batch of slave labor. They worked 30 days and died. And then they brought in the next 30. You didn't have to feed them. And they worked their ass off thinking maybe they'd get a day's food, and he moved them on. Speer was locked up in a prison for 20 years. In 1966, he came out and became a millionaire. He helped a TV movie on the Holocaust as an advisor for one of our lousy American documentaries. He liked Adolf Hitler. He liked the technological state. He liked the way Hitler used the radio and public address system. He could reach 80 million people and make them subject to the will of one individual. Speer claimed in his book that he wrote on the Third Reich how Hitler used the radio and television and teletype, what a genius he was, as a fascist using the media. Spears helped engineer all that, but Hitler's dictatorship only worked because everyone around him was sympathetic to it. They could have turned the media off. They could have yanked out their television, and you could do the same thing. When they lie about your news, you have a choice to turn it off and write to them or book publishers and say, I think you're a liar, and maybe picket bookstores with some information about the truth. I doubt if that will happen, but it would be possible to show your anger. Well, from 1966 to 1981, he had a good time. He lived 15 years as a millionaire and an advisor, and he was making a movie in London when he dropped dead. He died of what they call an apparent stroke. There's apparent heart attacks and apparent strokes, and maybe as the architect and production chief of the British television believed he just happened to have a stroke. maybe it's possible that Albert Speer knew a lot about Licio Gelli. Gelli worked with Adolf Hitler. He worked with Mussolini. He's in hiding now, and a lot of Nazis may die of old age, and he wasn't even very old. When I talk about Adolf Hitler and Nazis, and I hate the word neo-Nazi, because let's go for the Nazis first and forget the neos. They trained them. They have grown up. A bunch of them, the Liebesborn, are a ripe age now to run institutions and organizations like Martin Bormann wanted. And Albert Speer had quite a few years, for just 20 years, sitting well-fed and accomplished in a jail and not uncomfortable, not in solitary confinement like George Jackson at Soledad for stealing a $70 bike. He came out well-paid, just as Yuri Nosenko came out well-paid. Well, before I finish this airtime, we have about 4 minutes. There was a wedding this week, a very cutesy wedding. I guess you all read about it. It was Susan Atkins of the Manson family. She married this lovely character, Donald Lejeune, from Texas, of course, from Houston, Texas. I've alleged all the time that the Manson family was straight, pure Central Intelligence Agency, as was the SLA. Now, this little Sue Atkins is a doll. She had a $6,000 wedding dress made in New Jersey, probably by George Korkola's mother. And this character from Texas is building a $12 million house that he's going to put next to Frontera Prison until Susan Atkins gets out. He spent $6.4 million to free his wife of 1 week, and he's prepared to spend $100 million more to get her out. She wore her crucifix. I love the religious ornaments, the crucifix on her ears and her heart, and her French blue satin gown, and had a lovely reception in Frontera Prison. Another Manson woman wants a new trial, Leslie Van Houten. This little doll says in her trial that when she was charged with killing the La Biancas, they showed pictures of Sharon Tate, and that influenced the jury. Now, UPI Story Today said that people involved with the Sharon Tate murder and the members of her household, 4 friends, and she was pregnant, so there's Sharon Tate and 4 others and the baby. That's 7 right there. The participants were Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and Tex Watson from Texas. And the next night, there was Tex Watson from Texas, and Miss Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. Charles Manson, keep in mind, didn't go in the house and kill any of those 9 people. But Tex Watson is from Texas, and he came to Beverly Hills and worked with a Beverly Hills lawyer. And now this little darling, Don Lesueur, who's had 30 wives while he's waiting for Sue to get out. He's known her since 1965. She was involved in the killings in 1969. So he ran through his 30 wives, and now he's going to spend $100 million and sit on the fence of the Frontera Prison with his house, his $12 million house. And as I say, the bride wore a deep teal blue French satin gown. She wore a crucifix and crosses on her ears. The groom wore a coral-colored leisure suit and a cowboy hat. And I'm sure next to Lady Diana and Prince Charles, this must have been the most interesting wedding of this summer season. This is so disgusting. These people have been assured, you sit your time, Sue Atkins could be involved in killing 9 people. And of course, Mr. Spears only killed maybe 9 million, 6 million in the concentration camps, and then the soldiers to boot and the refugees around. So whether it's 9 or 9 million, you sit it out for 20 years in jail, and they'll let you out, and then you become a multi-millionaire. That's the way Yuri Nosenko is. He works for the CIA at the present time. If they do their job, and they do it well, there's cash for them, and they try to write our history and rearrange our lives in the most hideous manners that literally stinks. And if we get to the bottom of this, as Mitterrand said in France, it will continue. This is why he's going into the murder of one particular person and 6 associates, because if you don't get to the bottom, it goes on, and it gets worse. Well, that's enough information for 1 hour for you, I believe, and I'll be back next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and you take care of yourselves.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.